I'm Betty Salonik, CEO and founder of Accelerate Investors. Welcome to our podcast, Chief Investment Officer Conversations, which brings to you what is on top of mind for the world's leading CIOs. In our conversations, we will explore their background, their current investment strategies, and their global outlook. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Chris Ailman, CIO of CalSTRS, a $230 billion pension fund. In this episode, Chris shares his thoughts on what role the government should play in supporting individuals versus equity markets during our current economic crisis. He discusses his thoughts on active management in the era of COVID-19, and he describes the leadership role that CalSTRS has played and continues to play in furthering ESG principles. I hope you enjoy. And I'd like to turn to your CIO, but you also have a huge responsibility of managing the myriad of other responsibilities for the pension fund. Your first investment objective is to provide for present and future benefit payments, which are impacted by contributions. How does the current crisis impact states' ability to pay their required contributions to state pension systems? Is this especially concerning considering the existing pension fund crisis?
We have a long-term pension funding plan, the goal to be fully funded by the year out in the 2040s. We're at the early stages of that. So I guess if I came up with an analogy, you're about to run a marathon and somewhere at mile 2 you trip. That's going to hurt that pace per mile. Doesn't mean you might not be able to make it up in the future miles, but you don't necessarily want to count on it. And that's where we are. This crisis, and we still have to see. June 30th, our fiscal year end. We were back to positive return last week. So who knows where we'll be? And that's only one year in the marathon. So it really is going to depend about the average. We know we're going to have ups and downs. I think that the governmental entities are certainly going to feel a lot of stress. You're basically missing 2 months, out of the year of retail sales tax. In many cases, lots of different types of transaction tax. The unemployment levels, then obviously income tax will be lower. So governments of all sizes, shapes are going to struggle with this, just like companies will. The federal government doesn't appear to be interested in helping out states and counties, but they are helping out corporations. Hopefully they'll help out individuals more. So we'll see. It will be a challenge. I think that what we'll do is take a long-term view, sit down with our employers, figure out a way to help them survive this time period, but also build out the plan. Taking more risk in the portfolio, I've said very clearly, doesn't make a lot of sense in this environment. Averaging a 7% return, I think, is actually really very realistic. As much as, with interest rates back at 0, yes, that makes it harder, but it also makes risk assets more appetizing. So I think that over time, we can get back to averaging 7. This is another, we assume in that you're going to have a recession about every 5 years. And we've had some really severe ones. Obviously, the global recession of 2008 was mammoth, rivaled to 1929. This is a health pandemic we haven't seen since 100 years ago. We don't know what it did to the economy then compared to now, but we will see. I think that you're going to see most public pension plans, again, have to take that long-term view. What's the right way to fund the plan? Because it's multi-generational. This is not just about the baby boom or the traditional generation. It's also about what the Gen X and Gen Y are paying into the plan. What are the millennials paying into the plan, and how do we fund it over the next 40 to 50 years?
Now let's talk about recovery from COVID-19. Are you expecting a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, or a Nike Swiss-shaped recovery?
That's very clever. Promotions, I hope Nike pays for that promotion. I think, frankly, it's going to be more like a square root. And I'm sure many people are trying to picture that real quick. But it was a sharp drop, obviously, in March. It has been shocking to see the rebound in April. But I think the market's gotten very far ahead of itself. We're going to be stumbling out of this. If there was a vaccine, life would probably return back to normal within a couple of months. You saw that after 2001. Even though we were all frightened of airplanes, people got back on planes somewhere in 2002. So it's amazing to me how much America can adapt and shift. But you're going to still stumble out of this. I had a conference call with half my work staff, and lots of questions about how to return into the office. Do people want to return? What do we still do about the sensitive age groups? How do we travel? How do we deal with people who are traveling? How do we deal with visitors coming in? So just lots of concern about that. I think this does change the work environment, certainly for the services industry. Does everybody need to be together? So much of the service industry was moving to that technology culture of workstations and everybody on a bench together and cramming everybody together. And, I'll pick on Google, everybody eating lunch together at a deli, buffet line. Things like that are probably going to have to suddenly change, even though we've been in that mode for 10 years. Now we're going to think about that stuff differently. So I do fear that we'll stumble, certainly in June and maybe in July coming out of this. I'm worried about next fall and the resurgence. I really firmly believe by late fall we'll have a vaccine. I don't know if it will be widely distributable, but somewhere in 2021, this will have passed and we'll get back to work. And we'll have changes in life because of it, just like we did after 2009, after we did after 2001. But we will get back to life.
What aspect of the COVID-19 crisis concerns you the most and why?
It might surprise people. My biggest concern, frankly, has been the government's response. We may have more of a V-shaped, U-shaped recovery because of the sheer amount of government stimulus they have thrown at this problem. You're talking about an order of magnitude of 3 to 4 times what we did in 2008. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet is enormous, and it was taking over a decade to unwind that. What's it going to take this time? And the fact that the federal government has thrown money at corporations, not necessarily at individuals who are hurt the most by this or mom and pop. I'm very concerned about the unintended ramifications, unintended consequences of the actions they took. Capitalism is not pretty. Companies are supposed to fail, even if it's not their fault. And it's as an investor, it's not fun to hear that. But when you socialize losses, and we did it in 2008, boy, we're doing it like crazy here in the health crisis. That has profound impacts. It also builds up the government's deficit to enormous levels. We definitely are a debtor nation now more than ever. It's hard to think of now, but I think on the other side of this, we'll go and look back and learn a lot of hard lessons about what was right, what was wrong. Just like with the first CARES Act, what money went to the right places and what money was grabbled and gobbled up by people that really probably shouldn't have been taking the money. I think that we'll look back at the deficits and be deeply concerned about the steps that were taken. So profound, tough things, but a lot of case studies, I think, will come out of this. And we will certainly have a lot of deficits we have to pay back that could take a lot of time and unwind that Fed balance sheet.
You mentioned about firms maybe not being the right ones taking that help. What are your thoughts on any manager of yours, private equity or hedge fund, potentially having taken a PPP loan?
I haven't heard of any of the private equity firms stepping in there. They've asked for access to some of the low leverage loans to help with payrolls. And private equity, as much as some people think it's an evil thing, it's just another industry. And private equity is now about a good chunk of our economy are privately held firms. So let's just call them privately held. They need to be helped out just like smaller S-corps or other types of corporations. But I think there needs to be a little bit more judgment and a little better process. You can't post rules at 10 o'clock at night and then open the program at 8 a.m. the next morning and not expect utter chaos, as we have seen. And you can't just helicopter drop money out to everywhere. You've got to actually manage it properly. And I don't think that was done. I think in the rush to get money, to have a headline of posting money, the people that are hurt by this are the hourly workers, the people with the lowest education levels that do mostly physical jobs that are also close to people. And that needs to be really much more of a focus of attention. I'm concerned, even though I'm a capitalist, I have an institutional portfolio. I'm frankly concerned about how they focused in on bailing out the capital markets and particularly corporations. We should be talking about individuals, not equity markets and how they're performing or how indices are doing. So, as I said, trillions of dollars being going to try and bridge this economy stopping. We need to be helping out individuals. And so we won't know until, again, the research comes out on the other side and there's a real honest look at this. And somebody has an honest dialogue of what is the role of government in an economic crisis. You certainly don't want to perpetuate it like they did in the 1930s. You want to help resolve it, but is it the role of society to socialize losses for people who took risk? I'm not sure that's a good thing.
How do you think COVID-19 will change the asset management industry? Following the global financial crisis, the asset management industry evolved. There was a call for greater transparency and regulatory changes.
Well, you have to remember again, '08 was a financial crisis, and the epicenter was Wall Street, without question. This is a health crisis. I think it will change how people travel. I think it's going to change some of the attitudes about face-to-face meetings. We're going to have a lot more Zoom meetings. I remember putting in video teleconference equipment, which was very expensive in our old building and in our new building. And everybody said, well, so this is going to cut back on travel. Well, no, travel actually increased, didn't decrease. This time it may actually slow down for a little bit. I'm sure it will come back. Conferences with 400, 500 people, that's so important to many of the publications in our industry. That might change for a little while. I think the asset management industry, if anything, is going to recognize that there is a role for active management. This is very much an active management opportunity. So I'll be really curious to see the pressure's on. Will they actually add value? Or do they get beat up by the indexes again? And I think this is a challenge for the industry to prove its worth. Fees are very high. I think it's going to lose its social license to operate at some point if it doesn't add significant value at a reasonable cost. It adds value, but not when you net out the cost. So it tells me the cost is too high. They can't add more value. I hope that it opens people's eyes to external risks. We have been talking for a long time at CalSTRS since '08 about what we call inevitable risks. Sounds silly, but these are major risks that we know will happen at some point in our lifetime, yet it comes as a complete shock. So I'll pick on something like an earthquake in California. I ask anybody in the rest of the country, they're like, oh yeah, California's going to have the big one. Even Californians know that, but it will be a complete shock when it happens. What do you do about those 3% events, 4% events in life? Sometimes we buy catastrophic insurance for it. Sometimes we mitigate it. Sometimes we just accept it. And I think there'll be, as there was after '08, a deep look at those left-hand tail risks and how should we manage those within a portfolio and within asset management shops. It certainly opens people's eyes that you don't need all your traders on one floor close together. I'm not even sure you need all your portfolio managers. People like interaction. That's a critical part of that intellectual process, but can it be done remotely? I don't know. Do you need all umpteen million people commuting into New York together on subways and buses and ferries? I don't know.
What is your first priority on travel once restrictions are lifted?
My first priority is staying home. I think I'm much less interested in travel, but I'm an old guy. I'm at an at-risk age. I think we're trying to figure that out now, is that if we have our staff travel, what rules do the staff back at home want? I think it'd be better for people to go out, travel as much as they can, and come back, and they may be asked to quarantine at home and work remotely for 14 days. Probably the emphasis, without question, will be on the private asset classes, private equity, real estate, infrastructure areas we're trying to grow. And in many cases, it's not that we're going to travel. We're going to ask our managers to travel, because they're the ones that need to be out in the face-to-face meetings and kicking the tires on a lot of these transactions. So, but I do think it's going to be slow on the travel. So I think we're going to end up seeing, that's why I mentioned, I think it's going to be a slow recovery. It's not, prices haven't reset to a much lower level. So managers have, if you own a company, you're mentally anchored to the value it was in February. You haven't probably accepted the value it is today. So I don't think we'll see lots of changes instantly. And certainly the big conferences that are already scheduled for this fall and next spring, the ones that got put off, even I'm questioning them.
And now it's time for our CIO to CIO question. This question is from Marcus Frampton, the CIO of Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. He says the following: CalSTRS is such an important institution in the state of California, and because of your success over the years, CalSTRS has an enviable level of prominence amongst its peers. How do you balance delivering on all the important goals that you have set for the organization across investment returns, being a good steward of capital, and being a leader from an ESG standpoint with the attention that you get from the media onlookers, and whether they be supporters or detractors? To what extent do you find the attention and focus on CalSTRS as an industry leader a positive factor versus a distraction in achieving your goals?
Well, complex question, Marcus. Thank you, and congratulations on being the CIO of Alaska Permanent. Juneau is a very interesting town, and it's a great institution I have known for decades. So you have everybody in Alaska counting on you because they get a check from you. So I appreciate the compliment and the question. You know, it is a positive and a negative, as you mentioned. We're going to continue to be an ESG leader. That is absolutely critical to the teachers of California. We are long-term, and therefore we think about long-term operational business risks. Forget the letters E, S, and G. Just think about long-term operational business risks. We want to own companies that are going to be around not just for 10 years, but 20, 200 years. And we want them to think about how they're acting now and how they're acting for the future generations. It is helpful by being the number 2 fund in the country. And I think having a solid reputation. We're on numerous committees and councils and can work together with the Canadians, the Dutch, GPIF in Japan, the Australian funds. So that connection has really been powerful because many of them, frankly, are much larger than us now. Is it a distraction? Yes, we have competing interests. People have very specific individual objectives and goals. And frankly, sometimes their individual goal does not align with us as fiduciaries. They want us to do something with our capital for their good, not for the good of the trust fund. So just like with the Alaska Permanent Fund, it's a trust fund for the teachers, for the members into the future. And again, as I said, not just this generation, but future. So we're going to stay at it. It is at fun a challenge, but then also sometimes very frustrating, to say without question. But our goal is to keep our eyes on the horizon and achieving those goals, and as best we can, changing Wall Street and changing corporations to think longer term.
A follow-up to that question and the influence of CalSTRS. CalSTRS led the forming of a coalition in 2018 of institutional investors representing about $5 trillion around supporting firearm principles. I'm curious, what measurable impact have you seen?
You know, we are still at it. We've been pleased to see several more government entities sign on to the firearm principles. Just prior to COVID-19, we had lined up a whole series of meetings with retailers, particularly to really get into the details with them about how much their firearms meant to their sales, giving them examples like Dick's Sporting Goods to show them that by rebranding themselves away from guns and firearms to more of a family atmosphere could probably increase their sales and actually help them with these kinds of problems. So we're going to stay at it. I'm pleased. I was very honored just 2 weeks ago to virtually, not in person, but virtually teach a one-day course at Harvard as part of their longer course at Harvard Business School on ESG and thinking more sustainably, to present the firearm principles, what we have done. I'll be honest, it's a slow fight. Firearms are hardly controversial in our country. You know how divided it is. Goodness, after Sandy Hook and after Stoneman Majority High School, President Obama had Joe Biden, Vice President, take the lead. And after all that hard work, very little change. So it is a particularly a subject that is very hard to get people's attention in benign times. And then unfortunately, when inevitable crises happen, and sadly they will probably happen again in our lifetime, people are willing to talk and feel very passionately, but it's about grabbing that passion and sustaining it over time. So we're not going to bring about massive change by ourselves. We're asset owners, but what we're going to do is keep knocking on the door, keep talking to people, These principles really are tried to be principles that are acceptable both to California and to Florida. And ultimately, my hope, even principles acceptable to a place like Texas, that they will realize this isn't a red or blue state issue. It supports the Second Amendment. It's about a product that's safer and better for society. And let's be honest, the firearm companies, we don't own them, but the firearm companies are very interested in basically creating a war between criminals and police because they get to arm both sides. And that's not where they should be. They should be on the side of safety and protecting life. And I think they need to wake up if they want to survive, and that industry is very much struggling. If they really want to survive, people need to start paying attention to the safety side of it.
CalSTRS has been a huge proponent of ESG principles, including around climate change. How do you see the current crisis impacting the implementation of ESG principles, and how can asset owners like yourself effectively continue to hold its investment partners accountable?
Great question. I think this is an interesting crisis where normally better governed companies would have risen to the top, and poorly governed companies would be falling apart and would be in great distress. But since the government's bailing out and throwing money at everything, we're not seeing governance differentiated in this environment, which is interesting. Health crises are part of a global economy. We're definitely seeing the impacts on the oil and the energy market from the global economy and whether it ramps up or down. So it is a very much eye-opening and peeling the onion back and realizing how interconnected the world really is. And I think it's actually going to increase the focus on E, S, and G, not decrease it, even though they might be socializing the G losses. I think when we come out on the other side of this, we're going to realize that, and we have been predicting, we've mentioned pandemics. We didn't know it was going to be social distancing and stopping an economy. But we know for the fact that the environment's getting hotter, which means mosquitoes in northern areas that might not have seen them as much, or southern areas closer to the equator. We're going to see more diseases spread within humanity because of that. So I think E, S, and G, and particularly climate change, becomes a higher focus, not a lower focus after this. Right now, it's shelter in place and huddle through this. But I think when we get some fresh air and look around, we're going to realize we need to run this planet better than we do.
That's good to hear that you think it will remain important. I now like to turn to a few personal questions. What book would you recommend to our listeners?
It may surprise people, but the number one book I would recommend is the Bible. It's a book I read daily. It has a lot of insights on a lot of different areas. It certainly helps you through this kind of a crisis, and it helps you through challenges. So to me, that is my number one and most important book. For people that have that other questions, and I figured beyond the Bible, you probably want to know, I love the book Lincoln on Leadership. I love leadership books. There's another book, It's Not Your Ship. That's a very interesting management book. We all know most of the leadership and management tools, but we don't implement a lot of them. And I have to say, there's also a book about Jesus' leadership that I think is very fascinating, of taking a look at his life from a leadership perspective.
Thank you for sharing that. What's your favorite story or moment of experiencing cultural diversity?
Firsthand, I would say out here in California, I immediately jumped to think of my nephew, Ben Garcia, great kid, about to go to college in New York. If you saw his parents, you would think, with a last name like that, you'd think he's Latino. But you look at him and say he's not. But then when you peel back the onion, you find out that on his mother's side, his grandfather is Latino. And on his dad's side, his mother is Latino. Classic Californian, very blended background. And I think probably the most interesting experience was when my nephew got married. It was Catholic service in Spanish. And the different traditions, the different, and the entire service was in Spanish. So learning and understanding and appreciating the richness of the culture. In California, obviously, we have challenges, but the majority population is Latino. we have always celebrated many of the Spanish, particularly the Mexican cultural heritage events. And I think getting people to look below the simple name of something, but down into the fabric and being part of it, it enriches your life.
Thank you. What money advice would you give to younger generations?
Save. Save now. It hurts. Time is on your side. I really try to teach the younger employees and my daughters, I have 3 daughters, I've tried to teach their friends as well. It's not about taking a risk, it's about time. And my best example to them is the things in life that have the biggest impact. We're fortunate we don't live far from Yosemite. All of our kids have been there. And you point out that Yosemite was built by glaciers over time. Doesn't happen instantly. So the power of time, in that case, erosion, but for us, it's the compounding of interest, that putting the money away in your 20s and then not worrying about it till your 60s is just so powerful. So start saving even a little bit. If we even joke, less, 1 latte less, but just saving and putting money away and letting it compound, and they will be shocked at how it will grow over time.
And lastly, what is the best advice you've ever received or advice that you would impart to others?
Very early in my career, I had a boss, and I just thought it was so inspirational that in negotiations, he taught me to be hard on the issues and soft on the people. And I have repeated that to my staffs in Sacramento, Washington, and at CalSTRS. And I thought it was very interesting because recently I was listening to a book on tape about negotiating from Harvard Business School. And sure enough, their advice was be hard on the issues, soft on the people. So I thought the boss was so brilliant, but he got it from the same class. But it really is true. You've got to really focus in on the issues. And boy, today's age, does that bring up the classic, just a perfect example of not being hard on the issues, but somebody who's hard on the people. But, everyone has their own, is operating out of their own self-interest. You have to know that going in. There's no reason to be hard on the people. Everybody has a job to do. But it is, especially as a trust fund, I'm going to be hard on the issues. I have to. I represent other people's money. I love the phrase, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I have seen that far too often. We work with teachers. Teachers consider 85, 90% excellent. That cost to get that extra 10% of perfection is usually very low return for what you gain of 10%. Sometimes you have to really accept good and be there. And then lastly, advice I would impart to others is a phrase that's just always been important to me, which is iron sharpens iron. And now it's a phrase people might hear, but if you haven't sharpened iron before, then it loses some of its context. But if you ever sharpen iron, grab an iron file and sharpen something else iron, you're going to see sparks fly. Now, it's better. That object is sharper, but it creates heat, friction, and sparks. So it's not fun, but that's what it takes to make you a better person is you need to come up against other people who are better than you, and iron sharpens iron.
Thank you for that advice. And thank you so much for your time today, Chris. I really appreciate it. It's truly been an honor. And I look forward to you and your staff participating in future Accelerate Investors live events, such as our annual conference, once we're able to meet again. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Betty. Great questions. A real honor to be with you.
I'm Betty Salonique, founder and CEO of Accelerate Investors, and you've been listening to CIO Conversations. You can follow Accelerate Investors on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Thank you for listening.